Endgame for East Aleppo, with rebels losing territory. Is there any safe haven for those now fleeing the city? Good evening. Russian aerial bombardment appears tonight to have made a decisive impact on the war for East Aleppo. After many months of stalemate, the rebels have lost critical territory and streams of refugees have started the dangerous journey to try to find safety somewhere in the region. Tonight, we talk to the US State Department, to the International Rescue Committee and to a Syrian international lawyer about what must happen next.
Also on tonight's programme, the paedophile Barry Bennell, at the centre of the football abuse scandal, is rushed to hospital after being found unconscious at a hotel. Thatcherite François Fillon is by a landslide the Conservative candidate for the French presidency. He's anti-big state, anti-multiculturalism and anti-same-sex marriage. So would his election be a victory for the far right? And as UKIP's old leader claims to have refashioned right-wing politics in Britain and beyond, the new one elected today says he wants to replace the Labour Party.
And we're in the Cuban capital, Havana, as thousands of people gather to commemorate Fidel Castro. Some queuing before dawn. But is the younger generation so keen to pay their respects to the revolutionary leader? Hour by hour, the front lines in the Battle of Aleppo are shifting. Russian-backed Syrian forces now boast they've taken almost half of the besieged rebel-held east. But for the 250,000 people who've been trapped under heavy bombardment for months, the future is no more certain. Thousands aren't waiting to find out. They're fleeing not to Syrian government territory, but to nearby areas held by the Kurds. In the besieged zone, the White Helmets say they have run out of supplies to carry out their rescues and can no longer save lives in a city they call a catastrophe. Diana Magnay has this report.
Tracing a forlorn path through fields that before the weekend were a front line. That's moved further south now as Syrian regime forces make major advances through rebel-held eastern Aleppo. Children used to bombardment bewildered by this sudden flight after 4 months under siege. 10,000 people, the Monitor says, have already fled. Most heading for the city's Kurdish enclave, Sheikh Mahsoud. Even the very sick on the move. Whole districts laid waste by Syrian and Russian warplanes, now controlled by Syrian troops, who holler promises of safe passage up through the devastated streets. The major breakthrough for the regime came on Saturday when ground forces moved into the Hanano district. Now most of the northern part of the rebel-held east is in government hands. The Kurds, allies of the US elsewhere, but here fighting alongside Syrian forces, have pushed east. And in the latest fighting, the regime has taken the strip of land between Sahur and western Aleppo, which leaves the area still in rebel hands massively diminished. There, Russia and Syria's air campaign continues.
Today at about 8 o'clock, they bombed with warplanes, missiles, mortars. We can't even hide inside. There are too many casualties and destruction. It was raining bombs and missiles.
The White Helmets Civil Defense Unit issued a video message calling their city a catastrophe zone. With very little fuel left, none of the gear they need to help civilians, and continuous bombardment. The mother of 7-year-old Bana, who's turned her daughter via Twitter into a kind of poster child for the children of eastern Aleppo, messaging earlier that they were on the run, fighting for our lives, but still with you. The situation in Aleppo has happened before. In Daraya and Mordamia, Damascus suburbs, forerunners of the regime's siege tactics of starving rebel areas into surrender, whilst pummeling them from above with Russia's help. But in Daraya, deals were struck. Rebel fighters bust out of government territory. Here, it's not clear what will happen to those who leave, certainly not for rebel fighters or anyone associated with them. Fatah al-Sham's involvement in the fighting, al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, long a red flag for Russia and Syria in negotiations. For all the rejoicing on Syrian state TV, which bills this moment as a liberation for the people of eastern Aleppo from the hands of jihadi terrorists, there are still 250,000 people left, and trust in Syria's president is in short supply. Today, rebel shells continued to fall on western districts too. If the speed of the regime's advance over the last few days is anything to go by, they could soon take the rest of the rebels' shrinking territory. But at what cost?
Joining us from Washington is the Deputy Spokesman for the US State Department, Mark Toner. Mark Toner, thank you very much for joining us. What is the State Department's reading of the precise situation in East Aleppo tonight? Would you accept that it appears to be the beginning of a kind of endgame of a most unpleasant and ghastly sort?
Well, look, you've obviously just shown your audience the hideous images coming out of Aleppo. This is a continuation of a siege, starve and surrender tactic that we've seen employed by Russia and the Syrian regime over the past weeks and even months. It's unacceptable. We condemn it strongly. The Russians and the Syrian regime continue to carry out these tactics. They clearly believe that they can liberate, in their terms, Aleppo, but at what cost is what you rightly raise. We've seen, and we know for a fact that there are some 100,000 children currently trapped still in Aleppo, and they have no access to humanitarian assistance, no access to medicine, no access to food.
Would it be cruel to suggest that, as ever, America, in this particular theatre of war, is standing idly by?
Not at all. We continue to meet and negotiate in Geneva, trying to put back in place a cessation of hostilities. We're doing this on a multilateral basis. We're working with other concerned countries, and that includes Russia. Russia's in those talks with us. We're trying to resolve some of these remaining differences, and many of them are quite obvious and out there in the public domain. Russia believes that Nusra needs to be separated from the opposition. But in the meantime, they're going after both. The moderate opposition is what I'm talking about. It's a very complex battlefield. We believe that we can, if we're given a cessation of hostilities, do just that, separate Nusra from the moderate opposition. And then, of course, we can both go after Nusra, which is, we both agree, a terrorist organization.
Well, of course, the tragedy is that this would appear to have been deliberately timed to hit at the moment when essentially we're in a lame duck presidency. I mean, there's no way that America's going to make a decisive move at such time, and they know it. And then they know that Donald Trump is on his way.
Well, look, I can't speak to the motivations of Russia or the Syrian regime or their political calculations. What I can assure you and all your listeners is that the United States is not going to back off. This president is still going to be the president until January 20th, and we're going to continue to pursue his policies. And that continues trying to pursue what we all agree is necessary, which is a political solution to what's happening in Syria. There's no military solution. Even if they do take Aleppo, what's next? This conflict's not going to be resolved through military action alone. The sooner Russia, the sooner the regime realizes that, a heck of a lot more lives can be saved in the process.
But with respect, there is the most appalling tragedy unfolding on the ground, and it's been unfolding for months. Death and starvation, and now people fleeing at any cost, and no intervention from anybody. Nobody's necessarily suggesting you need to go to war, but you could at least drop aid parcels, anything.
Well, we've tried, as you know, we've tried to get aid working through the UN into Aleppo. The last time when we actually did have a cessation of hostilities in place, you saw what happened when several aid convoys were hit by either Syrian or Russian air forces. Certainly it wasn't coalition forces that hit these convoys. And after that, you're right, it was hard to get that kind of assistance in. Now, we are experimenting and doing some airdrops of assistance, but it's, as you can imagine, very inaccurate.
Mark Toner, thank you very much indeed for joining us from the State Department. Well, now in a moment we'll be joined from New York by David Miliband, President and CEO of International Rescue Committee. But first to Yasmin Nahlawi of the Manchester-based Syrian advocacy group Rethink Rebuild. And one of the things I know that you are engaged in is in a PhD in international law. And one of the things which has foxed so many people is why the UN system has failed, why the Security Council has not been able to deliver something meaningful on the ground because of the Russian veto. Now, you believe there is some way around it.
That's correct. So up until now, the Security Council has been paralyzed because of Russian and Chinese vetoes. But the draft resolution that the Security Council put forward last month was vetoed by Russia alone. If we continue to rely on the Security Council as a scapegoat for not engaging in any action, then there will be no action on Syria. What we are advocating for is the pursuit and the convening of an emergency special session in the United Nations General Assembly. This is an alternative to overcome the abusive vetoes in the Security Council when there is a situation that threatens international peace and security, as Syria obviously does. The Canadian government is actually involved in calling for an emergency special session. It has submitted a letter to the President of the General Assembly last month, signed by over 70 countries, including the UK, calling upon the President of the General Assembly to convene an emergency special session on Syria. And should this happen, then the General Assembly would be able to recommend measures, including the use of force, for states to take with respect to Syria.
Well, now, do you have any confidence that actually that could happen? I mean, Canada, alas, is not part of the Permanent Five, and the Permanent Five is the problem.
Right. Well, the Uniting for Peace mechanism, or the way to convene an emergency special session, can be invoked either through a procedural vote in the Security Council, which means that we would require 9 votes in the Security Council, and the veto would not count as a veto. The other way it can be convened is through a majority vote in the General Assembly. So that's the way to invoke the mechanism. And subsequent to that, the General Assembly can recommend specific measures through the vote of 2/3 of majority member states. So there is a way to overcome the veto through this mechanism.
In the meantime, as a Syrian in Manchester, so far from the conflict, what is it doing to you and to the people you love?
Well, the Syrian heartbreak is twofold. The first is obviously the family, friends, cities, neighborhoods, communities, memories that you've left behind, and the people that you know continue to face starvation by Assad, continue to face bombardment by Assad and Russia. So that's the first heartbreak that Syrians face. And the second heartbreak is just watching all of this and realizing that the international community is doing absolutely nothing. And as you mentioned earlier, John, it could be as simple as dropping humanitarian aid onto besieged areas. And if the international community isn't even willing to do that, then us Syrians have faced a very big heartbreak in this respect.
Yasmin Nahlawi, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Manchester. Yeah. Well, now we're joined by David Miliband from New York, from International Rescue Committee. David Miliband, do you think there's the remotest hope of, in some way, calling a General Assembly to deal with what is really one of the worst humanitarian crises in our hemisphere of our lifetimes?
Well, I think your fury at the situation is very well merited. We've spoken to people today, and they describe a situation like, quote, it's doomsday in East Aleppo. And of course, the key point is that it's not only in East Aleppo that there is a pounding of an incessant kind. In eastern Damascus, in the southwest of the country, there are people worried as well. And those poundings give lie to the argument that this is being done to target ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra. In eastern Damascus, it's rebel groups that do not fit into those two categories. And so I think you are right to say this is of a very high order of concern. I'm afraid that recommendations from the General Assembly don't carry the weight or the action that a decision of the Security Council carries. And it's the Security Council which can invoke force and deploy UN force, and of course provide legal cover for other countries to do their own actions. I think it's very important to say that it's political division that has neutered efforts to bring relief to the people of Syria. And inside eastern Aleppo, it's since the 13th of November, they've had no food aid at all.
Well, that leaves us with unilateral action. And here the government was pressed as to whether they would do airdrops over Aleppo. And the government responded by saying, I'm afraid airdrops over Aleppo should be a last resort. Hilary Benn asked, if this is not the last resort, what is? I mean, surely the moment has come, given that the West does have the capacity to drop food aid and the rest of it, to get going.
I think that the two things I would say in response to that. First of all, I'm afraid that the history of airdrops is far from simple. The dangers are real, both for civilians on the ground, never mind for the people flying there. Certainly they should be on the table, and if that's what if Hilary Benn has made the point that we're in last resort situation, he's absolutely right to do so. Secondly, it's vital that we don't lose sight of the core demand, which is for a cessation of hostilities and a freeze in the fighting, because until that happens, there will be no space at all for the political movement that is so necessary. One other point that I don't think has been mentioned on your show so far. I want to know who ordered the bombing of the IRC medical facilities this year. Our own organisation has had 8 hospitals bombed this year. Accountability for war crimes, and that's what we're talking about, bombings of humanitarian centres marked on maps that then get bombed. I want to know, as the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, who is ordering those things. And it's the breakdown not just of the mechanisms for action in the Security Council that's of concern, it's also the breakdown in any sense of accountability for some of the most heinous crimes that we've seen this century.
Well, the point now is, as far as the United States is concerned, where you're sitting tonight, we're about to go for all change, and it's going to be a Trump presidency. I mean, do you have anxieties in that direction?
Well, I was in the Middle East last week, in the Gulf and in Jordan, and of course there is a very high degree of uncertainty about what the new administration will bring. There is a recognition that the rhetoric of the campaign doesn't always translate into the policies of a new administration. But I also think there's a very important point in respect of Syria. There's 6 weeks more of the current administration, and that means there are responsibilities for the current president. But I think it would also send a very strong signal if President Obama and President-elect Trump together made points about the humanitarian situation in Syria, because there's no doubt in my mind at all that there's a danger that the next 6 weeks are used as a time when there is license for the abuse of international humanitarian law of a very severe kind.
I don't want to take you too far back in history, but the truth is we're in a very, very bad place, and it is fairly straightforward to track it back to the invasion of Iraq. I mean, to this massive instability that has hit this whole region. I mean, of course, it was associated with the Arab Spring, but there's also been the Western interference in what else has happened in that region. Do you feel any responsibility for that?
Well, I think that the consequences of the 2003 decision are clear for all to see, and in various aspects have been disastrous. But I also think it's very important to say that the uprising in Daraa in 2011 was a homegrown revolt against autocratic rule. And it's very important that in the West there is proper recognition of decisions that are made in the West. I was a schools minister in 2003, and I say very, very clearly that about the mistakes that were made in 2003 and the mistakes, frankly, that were made subsequently in the administration of the peace, never mind the waging of the war after 2003. It's also important to say that history is made by Arabs in the Middle East too, and the people of Aleppo who made peaceful protests in 2011, the people of Daraa, where the civil war started, were protesting and demanding accountable government. And I think it's very important not to forget that the conflict that's happening in Syria is not just a sectarian one between different parts, different confessional denominations in the country. It's also part of a demand for accountable and legitimate government, never mind the wider geopolitical and intra-regional conflagration that has been taking place since then.
David Miliband in New York, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, the paedophile football coach Barry Bennell is in hospital tonight after he was found unconscious in his hotel on Friday night. Officers are investigating new abuse allegations made by former players against Bennell. Our reporter Paul McNamara is outside the hospital in Stevenage now. Paul, what's the latest?
Well, Bennell is still receiving treatment here at the Lister Hospital behind me, after being found 3 nights ago in a life-threatening condition. Now, Bennell is the coach at the centre of the football abuse scandal. He was named just under 2 weeks ago by former professional Andy Woodward, who waived his right to anonymity. Now, Bernal has been living in Milton Keynes since 2015, since being released from prison for serving his third term for abuse. Police say that they received a call at about 11 p.m. on Friday at a Novotel hotel in Stevenage, saying that he was unconscious and that he was in a life-threatening condition. He'd moved there just a few days beforehand. He'd been moved to Milton Keynes, he'd been living in an estate there, and he was moved from the estate to Stevenage after the council received calls from some of the local residents. Now, since Andy Woodford came forward, the NSPCC say that they have had 100 calls from people saying they've been affected by this. One person came forward yesterday who again waived his right to anonymity. He's a former player. His name is Jan Nowacki. He's a former youth player at Manchester City. And today he spoke of his guilt at not coming forward sooner.
I actually could have been the first or one of the first, and if I'd have spoke up, then maybe he could have ended up in prison or even locked up. It might have put him off, or maybe it sort of couldn't have put him off. I don't know.
Now, just before we came to air tonight, Greater Manchester Police also said that they too are launching an investigation into historic child sex abuse in youth football. They are now the fifth constabulary to come forward saying that they're investigating this. And Greater Manchester Police are saying to anyone out there who may have been a victim, come forward.
Paul, thanks very much. John.
Now, thousands of Cubans are gathering in central Havana for a two-day ceremony to commemorate Fidel Castro before his remains are carried across the country to Santiago, where the revolution was born. As for his critics, they've stayed quiet or stayed home. Live now to Jackie Long in Havana. Jackie.
Fidel Castro has dominated the life and landscape of Cuba for almost 60 years, so perhaps little wonder then the enormous scale of the events which have been organised to commemorate him in death. Hundreds of thousands of people are expected here in Havana alone to pay respects over the next few days. The state broadcasters have been using every minute of airtime to look back at his past, at his legacy, but there's no doubt that many Cubans here are looking to the future and are anxious about what Cuba will look like after Castro. On the stroke of 9, guns sounded across Havana and the eastern city of Santiago, where Castro launched his revolution more than 50 years ago. From early morning, queues had already formed near Revolution Square, hundreds waiting to pay tribute at the monument to Cuba's national heroes. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans are expected to come here over the next 2 days. They will pay their respects, of course, but the authorities say they will also sign a solemn oath of allegiance to the concept of revolution and to keeping Castro's ideals alive. In death as in life, his image and ideals loom large. The capital is subdued. The usual music in cars and from windows is silent. The papers printed in black. Communist red mastheads abandoned for the period of mourning.
Miren, por favor, estoy diciendo que vamos a atender acá.
The first lesson for these students today, a briefing on plans for their pilgrimage. Studying catering, but schooled in revolution, keeping Castro's ideals alive, part of their vision for Cuba's future too.
I am very sad because this man is great, is big man, es una figura muy importante en el mundo.
He is a very important figure in the world, and among Cubans, he will remain our highest pioneer even when he's not with us physically.
Can I ask you, what do you think now about the future of Cuba? How will things change, do you think?
I don't know.
It's hard to say because nobody knows what might happen. Let's hope everybody will follow his ideals and everything will stay the same.
Around the city, though, many signs that change is needed. A quarter of Cuba's 11 million people live in poverty. But even they struggle to offer anything but praise for their former president. Tell me what you felt when you heard the news.
It was a hard blow when I first heard of it, but now we have to go ahead and get on with it. I hope that the situation will improve a bit.
Do you think that Fidel Castro was able to do enough for some of the poorer Cubans?
He helped many people, many Cubans. Now the people are hanging in there, waiting.
What do you feel now about the future?
The future is going to be really hard, really hard. We'll just have to wait and see.
Of course, the focus here is on their former president, but it is perhaps the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, who will also dictate the future of what Cuba looks like. He's been tweeting again today, repeating a threat that he may push back on reforms drawn up by President Obama and Raul Castro, the current president here, normalizing relationships between the two countries, which is adding to the uncertainty here. But for many Cubans, that is for another day. I've just returned from extraordinary scenes at Revolution Park, where in the shadow of Che Guevara, hundreds of thousands are gathering, queuing for hours in searing heat. Elderly people sheltering under umbrellas, but many, many young people too, singing out Fidel Castro's name with Fidel written on their forehead, their cheek. These commemorations will go on all week until next Sunday, when Fidel Castro is finally laid to rest.
Jackie Long in Cuba.
Now, Donald Trump has begun planning his future White House team, but just when you thought it was over, a recount of presidential election votes in the U.S. state of Wisconsin will begin on Thursday. And ballots in Michigan and Pennsylvania could be next after Green Party candidate Jill Stein raised millions of dollars for a recount process. Well, let's go live now to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. Kylie, what is going on?
Well, Kathy, the filing for Pennsylvania has in fact just gone in, and Michigan is likely later in the week. These are critical states, these three states, where Donald Trump really won by a margin of only just more than 100,000 votes over his Democratic rival Hillary Clinton. This isn't, though, being driven by her. It's being driven by Jill Stein, as you mentioned, the Green Party candidate. She says it's not because of widespread fraud necessarily, but she wants to test the integrity of the electoral process. Remember, the vote happened at a time when there was Russian hacking of the Democratic Party and when there were real concerns about some kind of an intervention. Now, Donald Trump, for his part, has been tweeting feverishly, pushing back against the recount, but then stunningly kind of did a backflip and said that he would have won the popular vote were it not for millions of people voting illegally, something for which there's absolutely no evidence. If the Green Party candidate Jill Stein has her way, every single vote cast by these and every other voter in Pennsylvania will have to be recounted. A new count by hand of votes cast in Wisconsin is due to start on Thursday, by which time she'll likely have filed for a recount in Michigan as well.
We are not attempting to overthrow Donald Trump, and I don't expect that that will be the outcome. We do not have a smoking gun that shows that there was, beyond a doubt, vote fraud going on here. But let me say, we do not need to prove that there was fraud in order to justify a voting system that is secure and that we have confidence in.
I congratulated Donald Trump and offered to work with him.
At the time of her concession speech, Hillary Clinton declared no interest in a recount, despite the fact that across those three Midwestern states, Donald Trump's combined margin of victory over her was just 107,000 votes. Now, the Clinton campaign lawyer says they'll support Dr. Stein's efforts, although they'd not found any evidence of hacking or outside interference. We'd not planned, he wrote, to exercise this option ourselves, but now a recount has been initiated in Wisconsin. We'll participate to ensure it proceeds in a manner that's fair to all sides. At the weekend at his holiday mansion in Florida, Donald Trump sent quick-fire tweets railing against the recounts.
The Green Party scam to fill up their coffers by asking for impossible recounts is now being joined by the badly defeated and demoralized Dems.
On the weekend talk shows, his people joined the chorus.
They have to decide whether they're going to interfere with the peaceful transfer of power to President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence, or if they're going to be a bunch of crybabies and sore losers about an election that they can't turn around.
They may not be able to turn it around, but Jill Stein has raised nearly $7 million to fund the recount.
This is a fundraising, notoriety-driven fraud by a person who won 33,000 votes in Wisconsin to President-elect Trump, who won 1.4 million.
Back when President-elect Trump was on the campaign trail, widespread voter fraud was one of his favourite bogus claims. That seemed to come back to him when, defying logic, he sent another tweet claiming that voter fraud was so real it had in fact cost him the popular vote.
In addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
There's no evidence that this is true. In fact, Hillary Clinton has won the popular vote by more than 2 million. It seems even the electoral vote that Donald Trump won with the White House as his prize isn't enough to satisfy his passion for winning. Away from politics, I should just bring you up to date with another story. This is a story from Ohio State University this morning, where the whole campus was put on shutdown. It's in Columbus. There was a young man who's an 18-year-old student this morning who apparently drove his car onto the campus, drove toward a group of students. I think you can see picture. It's a kind of open plan, modern campus. He drove toward a group of students, driving into a number of them. He got out of the car with a knife and started slashing other students. The university sent out an alert telling people to run, hide and fight. Or to continue to shelter in place. At least 9 people were hurt. The suspect himself was shot dead. We know very little about him. Officials are saying they think it was clearly a deliberate attack, but more investigation now by the Joint Terrorism Task Force into exactly what happened.
Kylie, thanks very much.
Now here, Brexit could face a new legal challenge from a think tank which claims the UK could stay inside the single market even if it leaves the European Union. It's now seeking a judicial review of the government's position, arguing that it acted unlawfully. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, was meeting her Polish counterpart at number 10 today, promising to guarantee the rights of all EU citizens currently living here. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this report.
Not every Prime Minister gets a welcome at the airport, but Northolt Airport in northwest London is by the Polish War Memorial, where Theresa May and Beata Szydło laid wreaths in memory of Second World War airmen. The government wants to create some goodwill where it can amongst the 27 countries who are staying in the EU. And to help with that, it announced 150 British troops would be deployed in Poland to help deter Russian aggression. 2 allies of the United States sounding a very different note from President-elect Donald Trump on Russia.
It is unacceptable for us that today Russia is an aggressive country.
Theresa May indicated that Europe could not take cooperation with Britain over many security issues for granted in the Brexit negotiations.
Of course, there'll be issues around the Justice and Home Affairs area where we're party to arrangements within the European Union as a member of the EU at the moment, where we'll have to consider what the future relationship will be. In many of those, for example, Europol is one of those. We are a major contributor to Europol.
Last month, Theresa May in her conference speech promised laws made in Britain, not in Europe. The government today announced it would accept the primacy of EU law over patents. But Remain supporters, trying to influence the shape of Brexit, want much more than that.
I'm certainly delighted to join in this cross-party anti-hard Brexit counter-insurgency, which you see before you.
Nick Clegg with Labour's Chuka Umunna and Tory former Minister Anna Soubry joining forces to campaign against a selective Brexit deal that gives some sectors of the economy the benefits of unimpeded access to the single market and not others. They think a transitional arrangement will be necessary. Someone in Whitehall doesn't agree. Notes of a meeting photographed in Downing Street today suggest somebody, maybe a minister in the Brexit department, said, transitional, loath to do it. We need to bring an end to the negotiation. Theresa May is hoping that building up relations with individual countries amongst the 27 remaining in the EU will help Britain get the deal it needs.
Theresa May had already signalled that she's not that squeamish when it comes to deciding what is and isn't up for trade in the Brexit talks. She'd signalled that the rights of EU citizens living in this country, including hundreds of thousands of Poles, were up for trade. Today she went a step further, spelling out that Britain's outsized capacity and expertise in counter-terrorism, specialist crime work and defence is also up for negotiation. In Whitehall, officials even have a term for it. They call it our security surplus. Gary Goodman, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
The outgoing UKIP leader claims to have refashioned the politics of the centre-right after Brexit. Now the party's new leader says he wants to wipe Labour off the electoral map. Paul Nuttall says he wants to make UKIP the voice of the working class. Here's our political correspondent, Michael Crick.
It was day one of the post-Farage era, where whoever emerged victorious planned to take UKIP in a new direction.
Mr Nuttall, you confident?
Yes, but not complacent.
Have you got your concession speech ready then, Ms Evans?
Oh, I've written several speeches, Michael.
This is not Nigel's day, we were told, and at first we struggled to find Donald Trump's transatlantic chum.
Isn't this a bit rich? There you are, you fight to get control of your country back, and then you go off and decide you want some other country.
No. Listen, I can confirm I'm not emigrating to America.
Are you one of the peers that Mr Nuttall wants to create?
Mr Nuttall could want to create as many peers as he wants. Thus far, we've not been given a single one.
Would you take one?
No.
You wouldn't take a peerage?
No.
The result, when it came, was decisive. Paul Nuttall got almost 2/3 the votes.
The successful candidate with 62.6% of the votes, Paul Nuttall.
After the infighting of the Farage years, UKIP now had to unite, Paul Nuttall insisted. His big aim, he stressed, was to win working-class Labour voters.
My ambition is not insignificant. I want to replace the Labour Party and make UKIP the patriotic voice of working people.
Well, under Nigel Farage, UKIP did huge damage to David Cameron's Conservative Party. Now, Paul Nuttall, the working-class Scouser, is making it clear that UKIP's main target is Labour under Jeremy Corbyn.
Labour MP Dan Jarvis sees UKIP as a huge threat, having won the by-election 5 years ago, where UKIP came second in a Westminster contest for the very first time.
Who knows what the future will bring? Paul Nuttall has said some pretty concerning things about the NHS, and I think they will be unpopular. But we need to understand that for too long, UKIP have posed a real threat to us, not just in our heartland seats, but around the country. And now is the moment where we really have to focus our minds on how we respond to that threat.
But Paul Nuttall's a working-class Scouser. He's not a sort of London public school boy like Nigel Farage. He must be surely more of a threat to your core vote.
Well, that's the risk.
Suzanne Evans, once UKIP's rising star, fared so badly today she lost her £5,000 deposit.
I'm really pleased with the result. It's been great to work with Paul over the campaign.
But he's not made you deputy leader, he's not made you chairman.
No,
you were going to make him deputy leader.
I suggest you just hold your horses a little bit and see what perhaps he has to say over the next couple of days.
So you think there's a job in the pipeline for you?
I'm certainly hoping so. Yeah, I'm certainly hoping so.
But I mean, now you've been defeated so badly, isn't it time for you to rethink and go back to the Conservatives?
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely.
You can guarantee you won't?
Yep, absolutely not.
But despite Nuttall's calls for unity, his predecessor couldn't resist a dig.
What did you think of the vote for Suzanne Evans?
Very high.
Very high? You surprised?
Very high, very surprised.
But 19% you thought was high?
Remarkable. I thought it'd be far lower, yeah.
What did you think it was going to be then?
Well, I thought below 10 probably, but there you are.
UKIP hope today puts them back in business. And despite recent troubles, they too are still above 10% in the polls. Still ahead of the Lib Dems.
Michael Crick reporting. Well, earlier I went to speak to Mr Nuttall and I asked him whether, after the loss of some high-profile members and the departure of Mr Farage, he would have to start from scratch as UKIP leader.
I think we've got a fantastic platform to build from. We've still got over 30,000 members. We're still 13% in the polls. And no, we're not losing Nigel Farage. You know, he will continue to be front of house for the party. He will continue to be on television shows.
What does front of house mean?
Well, television shows, the airwaves. And in terms of money, the party's in a healthy financial position.
Now, your new natural base, you're hoping, is going to be working class Labour voters in the north. And you're going to stay in the north yourself in order to deliver them.
Well, I disagree, actually, in the sense that it's going to be in the north. There are working class communities all over the country.
Yeah, but
in the
your
south,
emphasis is Labour, isn't it?
There are open goals, John, in Labour Party constituencies, because many of the people who live there now feel absolutely no connection with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And what we're going to do is to start talking about the issues that affect them: immigration, crime, social mobility, and we're going to move on to Labour's turf.
Well, one of the things you're going to be talking about is health, the NHS, and you're in favour of privatisation.
No,
that could affect the working man and woman.
Hang on. I made a speech about 6 years ago when I was talking about procurement. UKIP's policy is very clear. We believe that the National Health Service should remain public and free at the point of delivery, and beyond that, we want to ensure that we do away with health tourism, and that the National Health Service is a national health service and not an international health service.
But you've described it as completely unfit for purpose in the same sense that, for example, it's too big and it's too unwieldy and it costs too much. Well, all those are things you have said.
In some areas, John, there are problems within the NHS in terms of procurement, whereby the NHS is paying 30% over the odds for certain drugs. And it cannot be right that 51% of people who work in the NHS in England are not clinically qualified. Of course, in some areas it needs to be streamlined, but there should be money spent on the NHS. In fact, the money should be increased.
Let's take another issue: capital punishment.
Yeah.
You're in favour of the death penalty.
Well, I've made it clear over the years I believe in the death penalty for the killers of children. That isn't going to be UKIP policy. That isn't going to be in the UKIP manifesto. That is my own personal belief.
So there's disagreement in the party?
No, there's going to be no disagreement. It's not going to be in the UKIP manifesto. It's not going to be pushed.
So there is no question of raising the issue of the death penalty at all?
No, what we've made clear is that we believe in direct democracy. If enough people sign a petition, say 10% of the population, in a small time frame, it will trigger a national referendum. And if that referendum was on the death penalty for the killers of children, then I would vote in favour.
What is the defining issue you would say marks you out as the leader of UKIP? How will we notice the difference between you and Nigel Farage?
My UKIP needs to unify first. You know, I stood on a platform of unity. I've received the biggest mandate in the history of this party. UKIP needs to get its own house in order before Christmas, and it will do.
But how are you going to do that? It's a very split organisation at the moment. There's a lot of tussles going on. You know that better than I do.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the split isn't amongst the grassroots. You know, they know nothing about this.
It's the people who run the party, which is worse.
There are a small number of people at the top of the party. I've never been part of any faction, which is a strength. You know, I generally get along with everyone within the party, and people know from my time as chairman, I will not take any messing. So my call for unity is an offer once and once only.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul Nuttall, for talking to us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, with me now is Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. Paul Nuttall there wants to replace the Labour Party. He's in with a chance, isn't he?
I've heard this before. I'm old enough to remember when the SDP was going to replace the Labour Party. It disappeared without a trace, and we went on to win 3 successive general elections.
UKIP's making great inroads into your support now.
No. The Greens are surging, the Lib Dems have threatened certain constituencies. We will have to fight for every vote. But Paul Nuttall has to make these silly claims because he's got so many problems of his own. He's got Nigel Farage breathing down his neck, and he doesn't have social policies worth the name.
But the problem is, people who once supported you are sort of pondering whether to or not now. They see a leader who wouldn't sing the national anthem. They see someone who's lavishing praise on communist dictators, and they see someone who's more interested in sort of what Paul Nuttall calls Islington dinner party topics of conversation, like Palestine, rather than what they want to hear about, which is immigration.
That's what Westminster journalists say. When we've actually fought actual elections like in Oldham, the Labour vote was solid. This is a kind of thing drummed up here in Westminster.
Well, no, but Dan Jarvis, your colleague on the Labour benches, is saying just exactly the same, that you need to start talking about immigration because the UKIP fox is in the Labour henhouse.
He's right to say that many of the people that voted for Brexit, and some of them also vote UKIP, have real concerns about job instability, about their children's futures, about housing and so on, and the party needs to address those concerns.
But are those concerns nothing to do with mass immigration?
Are you saying mass immigration is responsible for job insecurity?
Well, some people make that argument, don't they?
Well, it's a false argument. What causes job insecurity is predatory employers and a lack of trade union protection. We have to base our policies on migration in the facts.
But you're not prepared to consider proposing a cap on the level of immigration
We
at
are
all,
proposing...
which is what Dan Jarvis is proposing.
We're prepared to consider anything that will help our people, but we know now what happens if you pander to people on immigration. You know what you get? You get Donald Trump. All I'm arguing for is base our policies in the facts and then make the case.
Do you think there's any credence to Paul Nuttall's claim that you are just indulging in sort of Islington dinner party conversation? For example, I know that it's reported that Emily Thornberry, your colleague, is going to Fidel Castro's funeral. Doesn't that send the wrong message to people?
Well, it depends which people you're talking about. Jeremy's been talking for the past, ever since he's been leading, he's been talking about housing, he's been talking about employment, he's been talking about left behind Britain. It's a myth that he's not talking about core issues. That is why, when we fight actual elections, the Labour vote is solid.
Diana, but thank you very much for joining me. John.
After the break, waving the flag for French conservatism, François Fillon wins the centre-right's presidential nomination, but is he the man to see off the National Front's challenge next year?
Welcome back. Now, a Thatcherite Conservative or a middle-of-the-road professional politician, however you describe him, the former French Prime Minister François Fillon is now the centre-right's best hope of defeating the National Front's Marine Le Pen. Monsieur Fillon triumphed in the Conservative presidential primaries this weekend, but is his right-wing message still a threat to liberal values? From Paris, our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports.
There is something immutable about Paris. An open-air museum to a golden past, permanent and rigid, the best of all possible worlds. And so it often feels with France, so precious that when any politician tries to change it, all hell tends to break loose. The latest challenger, François Fillon, didn't look like a radical at his victory party last night. In fact, he's provincial establishment, a Catholic country squire with a 12th century chateau in the Loire Valley. But he is promising economic shock therapy for France.
France ne supporte pas son décrochage.
France cannot tolerate its own decline. France wants the truth and it wants action. These past 5 years of presidency have been pathetic, and we need to put an end to it and move forward again in a way we haven't done for over 30 years.
Just a few weeks ago, Mr. Fillon was trailing in the polls, so this is an extraordinary result. And because President Hollande is so unpopular, it is Mr. Fillon who is the most likely candidate to become the next president of France.
He might be the man who's going to change really France, because France has got to be changed.
But people vote for change in France, and then they say, oh, we don't really want to change it at all. It's marvellous.
You're very right. We've got to do the changes within the first month.
You've got to shock France.
Shock immediately. Because if we don't do it immediately, you will have the unions, you will have the demonstrations, and it's going to be very difficult.
Fillon is promising to cut 500,000 public sector jobs and to lengthen the standard 35-hour working week, which makes him as Thatcherite as any French politician dare become. So they say you're the French Thatcher. Is that true, sir?
Do you think I seems like Thatcher?
No, you don't look like Mrs. Thatcher to me. But he's been a career politician for 35 years. So unremarkable that when he was Prime Minister, President Sarkozy allegedly nicknamed him Mr. Nobody behind his back. Now he's beaten his former boss. Can Mr. Nobody become Mr. Somebody and run France? His main rival for the presidency, Marine Le Pen, was on the French island of La Réunion today, where she called him a free market wolf who threatened to make state intervention disappear.
I thought about the left wing.
But when it comes to opposing immigration, Fillon has stolen some of the far right's thunder, while his spokeswoman told me he's nothing like as right-wing as politicians in the US or the UK.
And you're not worried about Marine Le Pen?
Of course, we are aware of like how attractive Marine Le Pen can be, but I think just as during the primaries, when you will compare the electoral platform, people will see that what Marine Le Pen is offering is not responsible, is not possible at all.
Leaving the euro.
Yeah, so this is unrealistic. All the things that she's offering is just to appeal to people's fears, and they will realize that the only credible solutions come from François Fillon. I'm sure about that.
Within the next fortnight, François Hollande is expected to announce if he will run for president again. With unemployment barely having budged, he could be doomed.
I think it depends.
The Socialist Party spokeswoman told me that with 5 left and centre-left candidates vying for the presidency, they could split the vote and get nowhere. And no surprise that comparing Fillon with Thatcher is her best line of attack.
It's going back to the Thatcher era, really, when it comes to economic and social issues, and it's very reactionary when it comes to society issues, when it comes to women's rights, LGBT rights, when it comes to immigration, identity, the question of identity, which
so
obviously is going to be...
As an out-of-touch, regressive candidate?
Yes.
Fillon will probably dilute his conservative wine with water now. But despite appearances, France feels ready for change, even if many French voters will probably end up hating it. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Paris.
That's it from him, and that's it from us.
Amid Syria's continued suffering, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.